No magic at all. I've met a few of you before, but yeah, my name's Ben, and I was doing SataMap for a few years, which has been integrated into the, SataMap as you know it, sort of hang around, but yeah, I'm being integrated into the PCTA cloud family, which is exciting for me. I'm also still a farmer, farm north of Moree, so I've got a bit going on, but it's an exciting time to be involved in all this sort of stuff. So I'm going to talk a little bit about remote sensing. So there's generally a few places you can get remote sensing data from. There's the traditional satellite imaging, which has been around since the 70s even. There's been the airborne sensors, which have been around for a long time, and then recently we've had the UAV option come as well. So a few years ago I did an upfield scholarship on UAVs and how they could be used in the grains industry, which gave me a bit of background in and got me more interested in sensors and opportunities to collect data around remotely. So yeah, and that sort of got me more interested in the satellite side of it as well, which is what led to the SataMap application, and then sort of learning more and more about satellite imagery. If you're interested in satellite imagery at all, you probably know quite a bit about what I'm going to go through on this first slide, but basically I'm just going to start with what is imagery. What are we doing when you get a satellite image data? So what we do is we're measuring reflectance. So the sensors on the satellites or the planes are generally passive sensors. So what's happening is they're measuring reflectance off the plant or off the target. So with a camera that's got a flash on it, it's an active, it's creating its own light. Whereas with these sensors we're using measured reflectance, and our light source is the sun. So each sensor has generally several bands that run across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So what I'll do is I'm just going to turn my little marker on here. See that? Oh, that's good. And what we can do is look at that this chart here, as we run along the bottom here, we've got blue, green, red, near infrared, and we've got the level of reflectance along that spectrum of light. And the cool thing is that a growing plant will reflect differently in the different bands. So along blue, it's absorbing a lot of light, then you get to this green area, and it's reflecting more green light, and that's why the plants are green, because it's reflecting green light. Comes back down, it's absorbing more red light, and then once you get into the near infrared spectrum, which is the spectrum that we can't see, but the plants just reflect a healthy, growing plant that reflects a lot of near infrared light. So quite close on the spectrum between red and near infrared, we get this big change in an actively growing plant, and that's really good for measuring what's going on in that plant and what it's doing. We can also start to look at areas on this line here, which is what you've probably heard of, the red edge, which is some of the new sensors like the Sentinel satellites. They measure within this red edge, and this is where we can start to pick up a few things such as nitrogen content, that sort of thing, in those red edge bands. And down the bottom here, looks like there's a lot going on, but if you sort of focus on it for a minute, it's taking a few of the common sensors around, so the Landsat, the Sentinel, and showing you what bands are actually measuring. So your handheld green seeker, which is actually an active sensor, it puts out its own bit of light, but it measures here in the red, very narrow band, and here in the near infrared, very narrow band, to generate that NDVI value. And if you sort of look in this red band and you come down these ones with these arrows here, this is the Landsat band. You can see it measures red here, and it measures near infrared all the way out here. So the near infrared bandwidth on a Landsat 8 is actually different to the near infrared on one of the handheld sensors. The actual difference in reflections isn't that great, but it's interesting to know that near infrared on one sensor isn't always aligned exactly with near infrared on another sensor. And there was a lot, it's less of an issue now, but when there was a lot of the drones being used to capture NDVI data, they were just using modified Canon cameras, and the near infrared band, this is it here on a modified Canon camera, very, very wide, and it's actually going into that red band and that's making the measurement nowhere near as good as it is from a satellite sensor or one of the more expensive sensors used in a airborne plane. But now we're seeing a lot more robust sensors on drones used as well. That's not to say that all drone imagery is good either. There's a lot of issues with that. Drone imagery, which won't go into detail here, but if you want to talk about that later, collecting data from different sensors, I'm happy to answer questions on that later on. So NDVI, it uses that difference between the red and the near infrared and normalises it to give that variability of the plan across the paddock as an index number. It shows you that there is variability in the paddock using that data. And the SataMap vegetation index, so it builds on that NDVI, but we go and include a green band in that as well. And the green band helps with saturation. So one of the historically challenges with NDVI, especially in irrigated cotton, high biomass, barley, wheat crops, is that it would saturate quite easily, whereas you start including that green band in there, you can get a bit later in the season and still capture that bit of variability going on there. So that's why we ended up going with a slightly different indice there. So with the Sentinels, satellites and these red edge bands, and with a bunch of really smart people doing a lot of really hard work, the amount of different vegetation indices that are in the literature and are available is growing every month. So at the moment, the ones we're sort of focusing on is the plant cell density and NDVI, which are using the near infrared and red bands. Then you've got the SataMap vegetation index, which, as I said before, uses the green band as well as the red and near infrared. This NDRE, the normalized difference red edge. So it's basically a NDVI type of indice, but instead of using near infrared, it uses the red edge. And you can see there it's picking up quite a bit different variability, because this is all taken from the same satellite sensor on the same day at exactly the same time. It's picking up more variability in the northern part of this paddock. It's showing a different pattern than especially these other two images here. And then over here we've got a yield map at the end. So we've got a lot of different options available to us, and constantly working on figuring out, which of these indices is offering the best value, early in season and late in season as well. NDVI, if it's saturating, it's no good to us. There's no point having that data available to you if it's just a blob of, the crop may be completely consistent in high biomass, and that's great, and it's probably still of no value to you then. But if there is variability in the crop and it's the image is saturating, then you need to understand that image has actually saturated. So there's a bit of understanding that needs to go along there. With the extra satellite images available, especially from Sentinel, and there's a bunch of other new satellite options available as well, it opens up the availability to start generating change maps. So change maps, not brand new, but it's something that's cloud was often an issue in the past, because if you didn't get a good series of captures, it would be quite difficult to make a change map. But now we've got more and more opportunities. It's something that it's a lot easier to do. So it's basically just taking an image and then taking one from 20 days after it, and then getting the difference between them and mapping it. So in this particular one here, the first image was taken on the 15th of May, and then one 20 days afterwards, so 25th of May, and then you've got the difference there. So you can see that it's down the southern part of the paddock here. It's accumulated quite a bit of biomass here early on, and a little bit up here in the northern section of the paddock. The scales are a bit different here, so the blue is accumulating biomass. This image here was on the right hand side. The first image was captured on the 4th of June, and the comparison image was captured on the 24th of June. And you can see here that quite evenly across this section of the paddock it's accumulated biomass. Down here it's slowed off. It's actually, some parts have even just remained the same over that 20-day period. It hasn't actually increased the sensed change there. So with these change maps, they're quite simple to do, but a lot of caution needs to be to go along with them, because whenever you're combining two different data sets from two different dates, there's a lot of different variables that go into, especially a satellite image. The light source, the sun, has to go down through the atmosphere. It has to hit the target, and then it bounces off it, and then has to go back through the atmosphere again, and then back to the satellite. So it's going through quite a thick lot of atmosphere, which can add some variability to the actual data that we're collecting. There can be some other influencing factors on when the image is captured, such if it was like you've seen things like when you spray Tordon a bit later on and the crop leans over and exposes more of the leaf or something like that. You can get quite a few different things that can create differences in imagery, and when you go and combine them together, you have to be very careful of what that information is actually telling you. So any sort of change maps, it's good to know the exact dates of each image so that you know what you're looking at. And that's a longer period of measured change, 10 days, can actually be more informative than, say, 3 days or 5 days. So with some services offering a daily image type thing, a change map over 1 or 2 days, it could show some sort of change, but it might just be sensor variability, or it might just be atmospheric variability. So having a 10-day gap with these change maps is probably a good one. 10, or at least 10, and then usually 20s, you actually see more variability on the map, so it's quite a bit more interesting. And another exciting part with remote sensing at the moment is the development of a few different things that we can start to measure, not just measuring leaf area index or biomass or whatever people have correlated with NDVI over whatever period we're starting to look at. So the Sentinel, the European Space Agency, so they put up their Sentinel-2 satellites, which has been very, very much welcomed by environmental and ag type industries. But we've also got the Sentinel-1 satellites, which are a constellation of radar-style satellites. And radar is very different to the optical satellites because it's an active sensor. So it puts out its radar on both a horizontal and a vertical, and then it receives it back on both horizontal and vertical. And it actually is, I guess for all intents and purposes, not affected by cloud, so it can see through cloud, but it's measuring very different data than optical imagery is. It's not going to give you a red, green, blue colour image like the optical satellites like the Sentinel-2. But one of the things that, its common uses are measuring glacier movements, seeing ships at sea, looking at flood water, anything where there's a texture that's different, surface texture. It's really good at measuring that and measuring it through, and like topographic changes by using a stereo effect. There's lots of globally lots of really good uses for it. And another one of those is soil moisture. So we're starting to hear more and more people talk about the potential of measuring soil moisture from satellite. And just a few, I guess, insights on that, and as to why it's not sort of a product that SataMap's been offering or AgCloud right away as soon as SataMap, the Sentinel-1 was launched. So the radar measurement is generally at a 1 to 5 centimetre soil depth to start with. And the measurement from the radar impacts, you can't just measure soil moisture as its raw data source. It's actually that scattering of the radar is actually influenced by the roughness on the surface, and influenced by the vegetation on the surface, and it's also influenced by the moisture. So we have to be able to account for these two things to be able to measure this one. So there's lots of ideas, and there's lots of people writing literature and doing some science on it, and it's all very exciting. With some of the best results, if we can account for the vegetation with optical imagery, so combining the Sentinel imagery with the Sentinel-2 optical imagery with the radar imagery to account for the vegetation, or capturing a bunch of these Sentinel-1 images in a row. So historically, soil moisture's been quite well measured over really large areas, so 1 pixel representing a 3 by 3 kilometre grid, or a 1 by 1 kilometre grid if it's really good. But in our minds, we want to be able to measure soil moisture across a 1,000-acre paddock, and that's more difficult. But that sort of thing will, it's been working on it, and it's, I guess, we're only going to get better at doing it. But automating it and putting it into a system, it's difficult, but it's difficult to get good results, like robust results, where you don't have to understand the ins and outs of every single calculation that goes into it. Believe you me, once we can find a robust way to automate that, that's something that will become exciting to be made available. It's the same sort of similar story with measuring nitrogen. So like I mentioned before, the Sentinel satellites have this, so we're moving back to the Sentinel-2 now, the optical satellite. It has 3 red edge bands, so 3 bands that are measuring where it jumps from that red up to that near infrared. And you can see this is the Sentinel-1 down the bottom here. There's 1, 2, 3 bands, and then it goes to the near infrared band. So by using those, you can start to look at trying to get the nitrogen component and how it's spread throughout the paddock. This is something that we can delve into a bit later if people are interested into it, the ins and outs of it. But basically, it's a matter of taking a bunch of algorithms that sort of already exist and correlating them together, and then getting a really good dry biomass ready from the ground, calibrating it back. So it's possible on a paddock by paddock basis, but again, trying to automate that and give you a number that's just not just pulled out of the backside as far as nitrogen goes. It's a bit more difficult, but there's it's an exciting development, and there's a lot of research being done about it. But this comment down here, if it's something you're really interested in, there's a really good full text article about measuring nitrogen in wheat crop. So imagery is a really exciting space to be in, and there's a lot of different stuff going on. There's not a lot of better source of in-crop variability. So with these Sentinel satellites, the Landsat satellites, and the bunch of other constellations that are being put up there, it is a very cost-effective way to measure what's going on. And combining different dates and the different bandwidths, there's a lot of opportunity there. But I just wanted to end with a few cautions, I suppose, that although it's really easy to click a button and get imagery, no matter what platform you use or where you get it from, the reality is that collecting imagery, it's not a simple technology. Like Broughton talked about the EM before, and the gamma and all that. People have put a lot of work in to make it the process automated and to arrive to you, but there needs to be consideration for atmosphere and georeplication and cloud. I haven't even talked about cloud, but cloud gives me, it's probably my biggest headache, is managing for cloud, trying to predict cloud, find where cloud is and where it isn't. The soil moisture and the measuring nitrogen, they're exciting developments, and they work. The soil moisture one works well over a very large area, the low resolution, like the 1 kilometre resolution type stuff, but in paddock it's much more difficult to do because surface roughness can change unexpectedly and that sort of thing, but it's something that we're working on. And the nitrogen measurement, it's a similar sort of thing that it's, I guess the theory's there, it's just a matter of trying to get the proof that it's working and measuring what we want it to before it's just distributed as an automated process. And even though our imagery is getting more accurate, it's getting more plentiful, it doesn't negate the need to collect your yield data and have it calibrated and all your other soil data, because although your plant's probably one of your best sensors for what's actually going on, there's so many different reasons that a plant can be doing what it's doing, and all the imagery is telling us is the variability in that plant across the paddock. And there is so many imagery sources, there's so much imagery that can be put in front of you. Don't get distracted from what you're very best at doing by spending too much time looking at imagery. It's not going to solve all your problems, it's just another tool in the toolbox. I'm not sure how many of you use the PCT SataMap software, but we're very close to having offline SataMap imagery inside it, so a matter of loading up the app, loading in some imagery of the areas that you're planning on going out and looking at or whatever else, and then it's available on your iPad or your iPhone without a internet connection, which has been something that a lot of people have wanted for a long time. So thanks for your attention, and any questions about imagery, I'll be happy to try and answer them now or later. Yeah. What are you doing, Smarty? Are we moving on, or are we?
If there's any questions, anybody got any?
Just you alluded to at the start about if you're getting a sensor for a drone, that there's various pros and cons.
Yep.
Someone for a second.
Yeah. So what we were doing. I did it too. So we take a Canon camera, and they would have a when you buy them from the shop, they'd have a filter in them that would filter out the infrared light. We'd take that out, we'd throw that away, and we'd put one in that would filter out more of this, because we're not interested in that, and try and capture, have its blue band, original blue band, capture a bit of red, or in this one it's capturing green, and then we try and have the original red band try and catch more near infrared and create a pseudo near infrared map. And now on the market we've got more, so the MicroSense, and there's a bunch of other ones that, well, Brad's here, he probably knows more about them, that are actually, have got narrow bands that are actually capturing the right wavelength that you actually want, instead of modifying a camera that was never designed for that in the first place. So it's, if you're paying someone to capture imagery, it's good to ask them if their camera is built fit for purpose, or whether it's just a modified Canon camera. Now, as far as collecting drone data, so having the right sensors, picking up the right wavelengths is to start. The other thing is, because the drone's only flying 120 metres above your target, if your paddock's any more than a hectare, or I don't know, the actual measurements, you're going to be stitching images together. And with that, there's all sorts of other issues that can come with that as well, such as your auto rectification. So making sure that the image is stitched together, and where once the image is developed as one large continuous image of the paddock, that it's actually accurate over when you lay it over all your other layers as well. So yeah, I don't know if that covers off on you. If that's helpful or not. Okay.
Just a quick question about the cloud. It's easy enough to see where it is now, but where it was 30 seconds before the photo, is that impacting the indices or the results?
Yeah, so cloud shadow impacts it. So you're meaning like if...
Like, Yeah, 30 seconds before the photo, the cloud was over there.
Yeah. Oh, you're sort of saying, so is the plant's going to respond differently to having cloud on it versus not having cloud on it? Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. I don't have any, quantitative sort of analysis of that. You can definitely see it if there's still some cloud shadow there, it influencing on it. But whether the plant was, less stressed because it was not in direct sunlight versus it having the sunlight exposed to it for a longer period of time before the image was taken, I couldn't tell you exactly.
Ben, you see sometimes people referring to mid-NDVI. What's that?
Which one? Sorry.
Is it mid-NDVI?
Mid-NDVI.
What's that used for?
It's in soil. That's in soil.
A bit more compact, so it's more in the so you use in NIR for more geology, some of the soil measurements, so that they're using a lot in some of the hand scanners and mine engineering and stuff. On a higher level of
You need one.
You should get one like that.
So yeah, that's the 0.9.
the big ones coming up with less than 100 grams.
Less than 100 grand. Check it out.
Mid-infrared sort of starts at about 1,500 nanometers and goes through to about 2,600
Yeah.
and then beyond. And so it's upper NIR. That's traditionally the expensive part of the spectrum. You get silicon sensors that work down here. They're cheap. Silicon's cheap. In-gas and gold is expensive. If you talk about the instruments that the Drone Corp uses, that's a NIR. They go to about 1150 nanometers. So that one there tops out.
This is 900. That's fine.
So then getting spectrometers now operating at 1650.
As you move along here, it doesn't just stay up here, it can dip up and down as you get a lot higher along. But as far as affordable sensors go, and ones that in the satellites, this is the main part of the spectrum that, I spend my time focusing on anyway.
What's your thoughts on the use of hyperspectral imagery?
So hyperspectral is important for research and figuring out what bands we should be capturing on our cheaper sensors. So, because they're dividing it up, hundreds along this spectrum, and then, doing their analysis and trying to figure out, what parts of the spectrum are most interesting for measuring different things. So, that's my perspective on hyperspectral.